Okay, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Tyrone Howard and Dr. Joseph Bishop. Can we welcome them to the stage? Where are they?
Thank you, Jane. Can we give Jane a round of applause for her tireless leadership and bringing us together? My name is Tyrone Howard, professor of education in the School of Education and Information Studies, and my good colleague here,
Joe Bishop. Dr. Howard is my boss, among other things. I'm the executive director of the Center for the Transformation of Schools at UCLA.
And so we're going to frame this issue around the unhoused in a more sort of pointed way around what we think is one of the more vulnerable populations, that is students, young people, and why this issue has implications across the board, why we have to think about how we begin to do something on the front end, prevention. And if we don't tackle this issue in schools where a large number of young people are unhoused, we're going to continue to see yet another generation of even more unhoused individuals. So I'll let Dr. Bishop get us started.
Terrific. All right, and Dr. Jane Sanders, thank you for inviting us.
Yes.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Shana. Thank you to everybody just for setting this, setting the stage for an amazing conversation. And we're going to bring it back to young people. If we could cue up the PowerPoint.
There we go.
Okay. So race, I'm gonna walk, not too much. So race, education, and addressing the student homelessness crisis. Race, education, and addressing the student homelessness crisis. I want to acknowledge our colleague, Dr. Angela James, who authored several reports which are going to be highlighted in our slide deck. So go to Dr. James if you have more questions. Okay, I want to start today this conversation. Several years ago, right before the height of the pandemic, I was at a drop-in center about 3 miles from here. It's called My Friend's Place. Anybody heard of it in Hollywood? Okay. Okay. I naively, as a privileged white researcher at UCLA, asked a young man about his experience of being unhoused. We were meeting on the top floor of My Friend's Place, sitting in a mustard yellow chair, I remember well. This young man's name was Sean. Sean had left early that morning across LA County, taking multiple buses. He moved cities depending on where he felt safe. And when I asked Sean about his education experience, he said, "Joe, I felt like I was passing through. I felt like I was passing through." Sean shared with me he had attended multiple schools, multiple districts, just even in Los Angeles County. And the sentiment was that most folks had no idea what his life story was, what his lived experiences were, and he was being overlooked. And Sean's experiences are a symptom of what young people across the United States are feeling, especially young people of color. Young people who are overrepresented in the foster system, overrepresented in the justice system. And if you talk to most young people who are in these systems, most of them have been housing insecure, right? So these structural inequities, structural racism is playing out in different ways. And let's just call it what it is. Let's just call it what it is. It is not, these are not just issues. These are very intentional things that we have done to our young people and our families for centuries, for decades, for families, right? So student homelessness, the student homelessness crisis is a symptom of that. Quick question though. If you already saw a slide, you can't share. How many young people do you all think, and this is a gross underestimate, are experiencing homelessness in the United States? Just to get a raise of hands. Anybody want to put it out there? In the United States, all 50 states. Too many.
Right.
What's that?
3 million.
3 million, okay. Other guesses? No. What's that? A million, okay. Dave, you're getting closer, okay. Others? Okay, I'm just making sure you're paying attention. So, 1.2, yes ma'am, Erica.
See, I was gonna say 1.5.
See, all right.
You're right there. You're right there.
You're good, Erica, you're good.
Wait a minute now, which definition are you?
Exactly, thank you, Bill. We were talking about this earlier. We're gonna get into this in our conversation. So this is the cumulative count. There's a point in time count, census count, which is taken in October. The cumulative count, this is from the U.S. Department of Education, is at the end of the year, and that's 1.2 million across the United States, right? Now we're gonna talk about definitions, a lack of a federal definition around homelessness. So these numbers, this is from 21, 22, these numbers are likely much higher. Because young people have to self-report. There has to be staff who can identify young people who experience homelessness. Also, we know there are stigmas around self-identifying, right? So this number of 1.2 has to be much higher than what it is as estimated by the U.S. Department of Education. So as we look by states, top 5 states, just looking at the distribution. So California has the largest count, but not the highest percentage. So California, Missouri, West Virginia, DC, New York, right? Top 5 states. As we look at counts, there's California, it's different than proportion. California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York. As we think about race, so on the bottom of these figures, you can see there's the actual enrollment, total enrollment, but as we look at student homelessness across the United States, of the 1.2 million, if you're looking at race, 2 in 5 young people are Latinx, okay? 1 in 4 are black, 1 in 4 are white. Black and Latinx students are overrepresented by 1.5% nationally. And as we look at California, 7 out of 10, or 3 out of 4 young people are Latinx who are experiencing homelessness. 7 out of 10, 3 out of 4. 1 in 13 black students, and black and Latinx students are overrepresented proportionally for the enrollment in the K-12. No, this is, again, school-age students who are overrepresented. So black and Latinx are overrepresented. And for white students, it's 1 in 10, but white students represent 1 in 5 students in the school-age population in California. Okay, when we released the State of Crisis report, it was, if there are any Dodger fans here, it was during the World Series, wasn't that long ago, and folks paid attention to this analogy. You could fill Dodger Stadium with an attendance of 56,000 people, almost 5 times with young people experiencing homelessness. It's currently 246,000. That's the same proportion, but returning back to, it's the same proportion as it was prior to the pandemic. We know, again, this 246,000 for this year actually has to be much higher, but for some reason, we've been socialized, or it's been normalized, where folks do not bat an eye when you talk about the number of 246,000 young people experiencing homelessness, right? But for some reason, reporters paid attention when we talked about Dodger Stadium, and this visual stuck with people, right? So folks were saying, are you sure about that number? Is that correct? The CD, the California Department of Education, has had these numbers for years, right? They've moved. They've been slowly spiking in the last 10, 20 years. And this was the name of the report if you Google it. We interviewed 150 folks across the state, early childhood providers, community-based organizations, students, staff, administrators, teachers, homeless liaisons who shoulder the main responsibility for supporting young people. And we want to give this large landscape understanding of what was happening, what was the role of schools in shaping the student homelessness crisis. So I'm going to stop there. That's a methodology, and Dr. Howard's going to take you through the data points and findings.
Thank you, Dr. Bishop. So for me, like I'm sure for some of you in this room, these issues, we look at the numbers, and we're going to dive into the numbers more, but these are personal stories, and we have to begin to put names and faces to these actual counts of numbers that we see unhoused youth across the state. I'm reminded often of my time as a classroom teacher in Compton, not too far from here, where I had third graders who far too many of them experienced being unhoused, and what that meant in terms of how they experienced education. If we think education is supposed to be the equalizer, what we cannot divorce that from is the reality that young folks who are unhoused experience something fundamentally different when it comes to educational opportunity. So what are those differences? The data here tells us, as Dr. Bishop highlighted, that there are disproportionate numbers of black and brown youth who are experiencing houselessness, but then you begin to look at what this means. We see that those youth who are unhoused have double the rate of being suspended, which means that they miss more time from school. And oftentimes those suspensions and frequently expulsions are not rooted in the reality of why students are sort of engaging in behaviors in a certain place. It's oftentimes a misread. So we need to do something different around teacher preparation to help educators understand the root cause of why we see certain kinds of behaviors of young people who oftentimes are exhibiting different types of behaviors. So again, we tend to punish those who are already suffering marginality. Same thing could be said when it comes to chronic absenteeism. We see the data tells us that youth who are unhoused have about a 16% higher rate of chronic absenteeism than those who are not unhoused, which again causes significant loss of opportunities to learn, which then explains why we see the graduation rates and the college readiness rates being significantly lower for those youth who are unhoused. Part of what our work has always been centered around is that you can't look at this in a universal way. There's a racial reality here that has to be continuously placed front and center, the way that Black and brown youth continue to be in these disproportionate spaces. So what did we find? First and foremost, as you're going to look at these issues around homelessness here in the state of California, there needs to be a county-by-county analysis, because what it looks like in places like LA County is going to be significantly different than what it looks like in places like San Bernardino County, Riverside County, Orange County. Our analysis even showed that when you look at counties, for example, like Monterey Bay, where you're talking about 15% of their students are unhoused, that's a significant number. Same thing for Santa Barbara County, so we can't come with a one-size-fits-all approach when there are unique geographical issues that need to be taken into account. And so we would suggest that any analysis take into account the localities, the histories, when you look at the ways in which we have seen significant sort of migration patterns across the state, when you begin to look at the ways in which we see communities being pushed out to certain communities, this matters in terms of explaining why we see the disparate rates across different counties. If you take a step further and begin to try to understand this, there are some challenges that we have to unpack, and those challenges are rooted in a couple of different realities. As Dr. Bishop highlighted, we know this number is woefully underrepresented for a variety of reasons. We know that when we talk about unhoused youth, this is a highly mobile population. And because they're highly mobile, we know that we can't get an accurate count. And then there's real concerns about deportation that we have to talk about when you have the number of undocumented youth in the state of California. So those numbers would be significantly higher. Then we also know that, again, some families don't feel like giving or don't want to give their status. There's a stigma associated with being unhoused. I remember as a classroom teacher talking to some of my students, and you start to understand and pick up on the fact that students who come to school 3, 4, 5 days in a row with the same set of clothes on, you begin to recognize that students who could not stay awake in class, you begin to look at students who could never keep any kind of sort of learning materials consistent, that something is taking place there. And so again, I come back to the teacher preparation standpoint of helping educators understand that the students who are oftentimes disengaged for a variety of reasons, there's structural factors that explain that, and there's a stigma associated with being unhoused. There's a school that is not too far from here where a principal took me there one evening about 5, 6 o'clock, and he showed me a row of about a dozen cars that were under the lights right behind his school. He said each one of those cars has families in them, and this is where they reside because it's a well-lit, safe place. So you've got to begin to humanize what this means. In some cases, there are 3, 4, 5 family members in a car. At one point, they opened up the school in the morning to let the students and the families come in to use the facilities. But this is what we expect students to somehow overcome as they walk into classrooms in efforts to learn. So we have to begin to understand those challenges. And then part of what's important, that third bullet, and I'm glad the point was raised, about the varying definitions around how we define homelessness. Dr. Bishop talked about this 1.2 million students who we identify as being unhoused. That is the definition that we have from McKinney-Vento. But if you begin to look at the HUD, the Housing and Urban definition, they have a much wider definition. Part of what we know when it comes to unhoused students, that the largest subgroup of students who are unhoused are doubled up, meaning that these are individuals who are not necessarily on the streets or being placed in shelters, but they live with other family members. If you were to begin to count the number of young people who are unhoused, we may see that number even being double, and some estimates consider it even being triple of what it currently is now. Now, some folks would say, well, being doubled up, that does not technically fall under the definition of being a house. When you begin to understand the complexities of what it means to be doubled up, and the anxiety and the displacement and the discomfort that comes from living in a different set of circumstances, you begin to see that those young people have the same challenges that individuals have who are placed in other circumstances. So the key is we need to have a consistent definition. If we can't have a consistent definition, we can't have a consistent count. If we can't have a consistent count, then we can't have adequate services to help support this vulnerable population. So in the report, and I'm not going to bore you with the details because we found some powerful findings here, but some of the findings that I'll highlight real quickly is the fact that part of what we know is that the current capacity to support students who are unhoused is inadequate. Over 45% of students who are currently in schools, 40% of students who are unhoused don't have schools that have adequate support services to give them the kind of interventions that they need. So though we have McKinney-Vento, it's been woefully underfunded, and so you have schools who are basically kind of sort of trying to figure out how to stretch limited resources to help support a growing population of students who are unhoused. We also know that, again, homeless liaisons who are supposedly dedicated only to helping those students who are unhoused are typically wearing 4 or 5 different hats. They not only support the students who are unhoused, they support foster youth, they support migrant youth, they support students whose first language is not English. And so these individuals solely focused on youth who are unhoused are oftentimes sort of being burdened beyond their capacity. I will keep, and we will keep bringing up the fact that we cannot look at this divorced from the racial considerations of what it means for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth. And so as we think about interventions, they need to be steeped in linguistic supports that help support families whose first language is not English, but we also have to have culturally responsive approaches in addition to racially aware ways in which we support families, because there are cultural considerations in this. And I learned this when I was teaching in Compton, that there are lots of young people who get told by their parents that we do not discuss what happens in our own living arrangements outside of our own living arrangements. So that's why the numbers that we have here need to be really rethought, because there are young people who are unhoused who are taught and socialized not to speak about their conditions because that may bring unwanted attention, the fear of not only deportation for some families, but the fear of DCFS intervention, which is another concern and consideration. So even though families who are in need of support and services may want to ask, there's a distrust warranted in a reality of the systems coming in and doing more damage to kids who are already suffering from a structural disengagement. And so we've got to do a better job, and we highlight some of the findings about better coordination between housing, education. Sometimes the left hand doesn't talk to the right. Schools don't talk to child welfare services. Child welfare services don't talk to housing entities. And so how can housing liaisons advocate for young people and families when they don't talk to schools? We highlight the ways in which community-based organizations and nonprofits can play a vital role in this process, but oftentimes the disconnect is just too glaringly apparent. And then we have to talk about the bookends of education. What we also found is that there is lack of a focus on what we can do on the early childhood side when it comes to youth who are unhoused. And then there's oftentimes very little consideration about helping young people who are unhoused think about college and career. There's this assumption that they've got massive gaps in education, which many do, but that doesn't mean that they should be to learn when it comes to education opportunities. So we have to focus in on the front end and the back end. We could talk all day about the student perspective. There's something about listening to young people who talk about their day-to-day experiences. Again, I want to acknowledge Dr. James because her work in helping us to unpack this with a couple of counties was vital. And these young people, you just have so much admiration and respect for their resilience of what they have to endure despite the challenges. But I want to get to a place, we need to get to a place where young people don't have to be resilient all the time, right? We tend to admire young people's resilience. Being resilient all the time gets tiring. Being resilient all the time can extend all your mental and physical and emotional resources, but young people have to constantly navigate worlds around them because adults have not created the kind of supportive systems to allow them to be children, if that makes sense, right? So when we talk to students, and we heard about the lack of mentorship and stability that many of them suffer from, we also heard that there's often, as we know, being unhoused is typically for some of these young people just one component. We talk about complex traumas. It's not only being unhoused, But in some cases, we've got young people who have parents who have their own mental health challenges. There's also issues in some cases of physical, mental, or emotional abuse that they're being subjected to. And so you're talking about complex trauma for these young people who are also unhoused, and frequently schools don't have the adequate supports to help them. So you can't tell me that I'm not doing well on academic sort of measures, but yet all these other things on the front end, basic needs are not being met. And that's why we have to be sensitive to what students are telling us. I think we as the adults oftentimes think we have the answers. I think we need to have answers that are informed by what young people who endure this every day are telling us, and that has to be our center point. We also know that in another report that we put out, No Shame or Stigmas, again, I want to mention Dr. James here, where we looked at 2 counties, Long Beach, the 2 cities, I should say, Long Beach Unified and Monterey County, to begin to understand the complexities and the variation of how we see homelessness playing out in their respective context. And what we found was a host of issues that make a difference is that outreach matters. We have to be more consistent in our outreach. Student and family supports, making sure that we are able to identify families without embarrassing families, without shaming families, without stigmatizing families in ways that says there are resources here that we can offer that can be kept confidential to help protect people's dignity. I can't stress that again, to help protect people's dignity, because we know that 1 in 3 homes where we know families are experiencing unhoused, there's a working parent who's in place there. And so that's the reality we have to shift the ideology, because there's an ideology that exists in our particular communities that suggests that people are unhoused because they just don't work hard enough or they don't value work. And I would make the argument that oftentimes folks who are unhoused are some of the hardest working people in our cities, but we know that housing is just so unaffordable, right? So we have to begin to help keep people's dignities, and collaboration is important. Training to all the different social service entities that are helping to provide supports has to be done. And then part of what we continue, we have to be focused on solutions, and we often lift up, or we always lift up in our work, what are the promising practices? What can we learn from? Where do we see there's some interventions that are helping make an impact? And part of what we recognize is that supplemental and additional resources matter. Wraparound services are important as we see the state really making a major investment around its community schools initiatives. Those are the kind of supports that we have. If school becomes the one-stop shop to provide mental health supports, medical supports, vision, dental supports, help parents with job training and those kinds of supports, it makes a huge difference to try to significantly decrease the number of young people who are unhoused. But that's oftentimes rooted in community relationships. Part of what we have to continue to lift up is how can community-based organizations be a key partner in this work. And I also want to bring up, before I pass it back to Dr. Bishop, the ways in which we have to look at the association between youth who are unhoused and foster youth. There's a clear through line here, because if we understand the reality being that the number one reason why young people are taken from their parents, it's not because of physical abuse or mental or emotional abuse, it's because of this amorphous term called neglect. And so what we do is that we say families who don't provide housing are neglectful, but we haven't given families the tools and resources to be able to provide for their families in the first place. So therefore, what we know is that we're trying to make this shift away from what schools and other medical entities refer to as mandated reporters. You're a mandated reporter. If you see something, you have to report. We want to make a shift away from mandated reporters to mandated supporters. Mandated supporters mean we're not going to take children away from families. We're going to give families the supports that they need on the front end to ensure that they don't end up in foster care. And oh, by the way, if you look at who the youth are who are in foster care, you see the same racial disproportionalities. If we don't make the link between youth who are unhoused, foster care, and youth who are in the juvenile system, we are not serious about addressing this issue. There's a clear through line. So that's why it's up to us at this point in time, if we want to begin to stem the tide on this problem, we have to begin to put our efforts and time and policy and legislation on the front end so that we don't see another generation of young people who become adults who experience these same challenges. It becomes this vicious cycle. If we allow that to happen, I would say shame on us to not do better, okay? With that, because I'll start preaching too much and I don't want to do that. Policy recommendations, we have a number of them. Schools have to have a real explicit focus on their LCAP funding to make sure it takes into account our unhoused student population. There has to be district-wide strategies that are putting on the table in a very explicit fashion how we support families, because again, we can't talk about students without talking about families. And that's where we have, our multi-tiered systems of support. MTSS frameworks need to be very explicit about supporting young people who are unhoused. And then on the city and county side, there's got to be greater collaboration, better coordination with services, and this comes down to affordable housing, right? That's the impetus here. As we look at the gentrifying of our neighborhoods across the state, we're seeing who's being pushed out, and so we've got to have greater coordination, and then greater focus on efforts that focus deliberately on K-12 efforts combined with college level kinds of supports and partnerships. I'll let Dr. Bishop take us home.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Howard.
We got one glass of water. Is that yours or mine? Okay. I didn't see that. I don't want to drink his water. Okay.
No. I had the same question. You can drink my water, Dr. Howard. It's all right. So, off script here. Behavioral health, $4.7 billion. Amazing. Thank you, Mayor Steinberg. Thank you, Governor Newsom. But without housing, it's like food without water. It's like food without water. You gotta have both.
Gotta have your water.
You gotta have both. You gotta have that water.
water.
But I just want to put it out there. It's a start, but it's not enough. Okay, the state of California still has a lot to do, clearly. Am I right, everybody?
Amen.
All right.
Amen.
We need better data systems, so a little research center at UCLA isn't doing the number crunching. I mean, make us a bigger research center, but I'm just saying. Increase access to high-quality early ed programs, right? Early ed is the space that we often ignore. Also, community-based organizations do so much, and state money typically does not go through CBOs. It goes through county offices. It goes through districts.
That's right. That's
and
right.
a lot of CBOs are fundraising to provide foundational services to their families, right? That's not okay.
Yep.
We got to change how we deliver funds. At the federal level, we need more Senator Sanders who are going to set definitions. So Senator Feinstein had a common definition for students experiencing homelessness. It did not pass. I'm not quite sure, but maybe Senator Sanders or others will take it up, or folks in this room. I hope you will, because we need some guidance as a country. We need to fund McKinney-Vento. The $800 million, we talked about the American Rescue Plan last night, which was huge for our country. There's $800 million for students experiencing homelessness. Schoolhouse Connection did a lot to make that happen with members of Congress. But that was one-time money, right? One-time money, and that money is all drying up. If you interview homeless liaisons, folks who work at districts across the country, they'll tell you that money was incredibly useful, right? Folks needed resources and staffing now, but the money's going away, right? We have to fund McKinney-Vento, but that is just a starting point. Community schools at the federal level and the state level, we need more money. We need more comprehensive efforts, but we also need accountability to make sure the funds are addressing the historic inequities that community schools were intended to address. We need to think about, for older students, for students who are college age, how are we ensuring that they have the infrastructure and support, even if they've transitioned out, to be successful, to finish college, to have a life of dignity, success, health, and happiness like we all aspire to have. We could go much longer in recommendations. We're going to stop now. But the key takeaway, if it wasn't clear to you, well, it was already clear to you because you're here based on the agenda, but no one system can address homelessness and isolation. Am I right?
That's right.
No one system.
That's right.
A coordinated, multi-pronged approach is needed from all levels of government, from the public, the private sector. Everybody has responsibility to play, and you all are converted. We have to figure out how to get people outside of this room to join us, because unless we do, the work is too far, but is too challenging, but we can do it together. Thank you all for your time. Let's go to Q&A.
Yep. Good job, Doc. Good job.
Thanks, man. Good job.
Excellent. Got a question right up front. Mike is on the way.
Thank you. My quick question is, how are you addressing how some of these school systems are targeting unhoused children and their families? I understand about LCAP, but those monies are directed towards them. However, the solution seems to be throughout the school system to how they call themselves remedying it is reporting these families to DCFS. So it causes them not to get the help that they need.
Yeah, so that's why I think that there needs to be a major sort of way of how we think about educating folks who are in not just education, but it's also medicine and it's law enforcement to help them to understand the issues tied to this term neglect. In so many ways, again, people are operating under a culture of fear, meaning that if I don't report, I may be held liable. And so part of what we're trying to do then is begin to help enlighten schools and educational entities about the ways in which there are various community-based organizations that are available. If a child comes to school on a cold, rainy day and doesn't have a coat, we shouldn't then call DCFS to take this child away from her mom. Let's get the kid a coat, right? It's those kind of approaches. And so we have to help folks understand that DCFS should be a last resort, not a first resort. And that's what happens all too often is that we see situations that are what we've done in this country is just call a spade. We've criminalized poverty. And so we see young people who are living in poverty and we find a way to criminalize them and then tear apart families, which to me is outright just unethical. But thank you for that question. It was important.
I mean, I guess
Okay.
it's a very interesting dichotomy between your presentation and the presentation we just heard from the governor and the mayor of Sacramento, which is, I mean, everything that they were describing was top-down, right? Everything was mandates and programs that we have designed and we're going to take more and more power or responsibility away from the localities which are closest to the problem, right? But also, I mean, you mentioned about the community-based organizations, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not even on the agenda or in the discussion, as far as I know.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you know, basically the state kind of treats its providers as unindicted felons.
Wow.
Tell us how you really feel, Mike.
So I mean, you're talking a lot about eyes on a problem, you know, for each individual. I mean, how do you bridge this gap between, you know, we know better, and this is what has to be done, and is there even a discussion going on between the community level and the policymakers?
Great question.
So there's an opportunity through a state lawsuit, the Kayla J lawsuit, which is about the inequitable education for low-income students and students of color across California, but in particular in Oakland and Los Angeles. As part of the settlement, which you'll hear more about, it's in the paper if you Google Kayla J, there's community-based organizations are eligible for funding to support young people, and it's called out in the settlement of that $2 billion at least. I think there could be leverage within that to move, or there's a precedent set formally, potentially, where CBOs could have allowable use of funds of state money. But Michael, I think to your point, I think we probably need not only better evidence to show that CBOs do incredible work, because folks say, well, show me how is this better than what this agency is doing or that district is doing. So I think we need better evidence, but we also need to demystify what a lot of organizations do for other folks. And I think about Pomona and Push, Cindy, we were talking about your work. There you are. You just started doing the work. It wasn't like you waited. So we can't wait. We got to get going, and hopefully the money will fall. But I think to your point, it sounds like there's an opportunity to push on who is eligible for public dollars, and to acknowledge that organizations have been doing it for decades, years, and doing it really well.
Yeah, the question.
Thank you. Bill Arroyo, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, just like that other guy that just spoke. I want to humbly suggest, you have an illustration there, the last slide, I'd like to point something out there. If we can have that last slide, please.
Uh-oh.
Go back.
I happen to be a child psychiatrist, former employee of LA Unified. So let me suggest that, no, the one after that.
The all hands on deck?
Yeah.
Okay.
You need to include maternal care. Okay, because that's where brain development begins.
Yeah.
Okay, and we know that across the U.S., certainly LA County, the mortality and morbidity, especially among black
Right.
pregnant
That's right.
women,
That's right.
is unconscionable.
That's right.
Okay?
That's right. That's right.
So that's where we have to start.
Yep.
Secondly, again, I humbly request you consider preschool, because we also know that especially black children,
That's right.
but also brown children,
Yep.
Yeah.
have the highest
Rates.
disproportionately expulsion rates
Yep.
among all children in the
Right.
U.S.
Yep, yep, yep.
All right, so let's not forget those two.
Yeah.
And then, last of all, I would say that while it is important to count students who are experiencing homelessness, we also have to remember that there are a large number of children that are expelled from school who don't enter the count ever,
Right.
That's right. That's
okay?
right. Yeah.
And so let's not forget those youth.
No, point's well taken. And
Thank
I
you.
think if I could just respond real quickly, I think the
Yeah.
maternal health issue, you're right, is spot on. And the numbers for black women, as you mentioned so poignantly, is just criminal when you look at how bad they are. And the criminalization of young people in schools, again, we ask a fundamental question in schools. We say, what's wrong with that particular child? I think we need to make a shift to what may have happened to that child, right? I think it's a different paradigm. And then those young people who are oftentimes pushed out. And look, here's what the data tells us nationwide. We start suspending children as early as pre-K. Pre-K, let me say this again, folks. Pre-K, those are words that should not be in the same sentence. Our babies are 3 and 4 years old in pre-K. What kind of behavior can you engage in at 3 and 4 years old that results in you being kicked out of school, right? And the reality is we know black and brown kids are more likely to be punished and kicked out. And that has implications, because when a 3 or 4 year old is not allowed to go to pre-K, someone has to stay at home with that child, okay? And then that means someone has to miss work. Someone miss work, they don't get paid. So there's this vicious cycle of how we criminalize children, and that has an impact on families. And so I'm so glad that you lifted that up in terms of looking at how that all kind of has a through line.
Absolutely. For the sake of time, can we take the last few questions all together?
Yeah.
And then Dr. Howard and I will try to answer
yeah.
real
Rapid
quick.
fire.
So maybe we could do the Donahue, we'll go person to person.
You
We'll-
aging yourself, Joe.
Yeah, I know. I threw it out there.
Donahue.
Fascinating presentation, thank you. So I wondered if you had looked into the correlation between kids growing up in substandard housing, leading them to end up on the streets, given the fact that, substandard housing, lead paint poisoning stunts people's ability to learn. Infestation leads to asthma, which all has an impact on their ability to learn and stay in schools.
Okay, so first question, how substandard housing impacts the trajectory potentially of housing for young people?
that's a good
That's one question. We'll keep going if we can go to the next one. Dr. Howell, you want to answer that while we're going to the next person?
Yes, if you look at our report that we put out called Beyond the Schoolhouse, where we looked at issues around LA County that were affecting black students, we began to look at geographical locations of where schools were located that were near pollutant areas, sort of land, waste, what's it called, Joe? Waste? Toxic land dumps, yeah. We saw
Lead
higher
and
rates of
neurotoxicants,
asthma,
yeah.
various neurotoxins that had a huge impact on brain development, motor skill development, impulsivity, which has a profound impact on young people's ability to learn, because we know brain development is being stunted in those situations. It's still mind-boggling to me in 2024, even in this county, we still have lead-based paint in homes that young people live in. So even though we talk about putting young people in homes, which is our goal, let's make sure they're in safe, healthy homes at the same time. It has to be a part of our conversation.
Great question. And then,
Yes, I have a question. Hi, my name is Angela Gardner. I'm representing Healthy California Now, And one of the things two things. Number one, the role of access to child care.
Yeah.
And the second one is health care, like child's health insurance programs, making sure that kids have access to Medi-Cal. Could you talk about that more, please?
Yes, so public health dollars are the second largest funding source for schools. We need to do a better job of bringing public health services to school settings as early as possible, right? We have challenges, though, around finding clinicians and staffing to make that happen. We have major shortages in education and healthcare. So, yes, the report talks a little bit about that, but that could be a whole report in and of itself. So I thank you for raising it. And the second part of the question, sorry, I missed the other part of your question, or your comment.
Childcare.
Childcare. Yes, and yes. There's research that shows a relationship between access to quality childcare, affordable quality childcare, and its relationship to housing and housing insecurity and the educational trajectory of young people. So absolutely, but I think our challenge is to help folks see the connection between issues, because they see these things as separate pots of money, or people will say that's the wrong pocket problem. We have the money sitting there, but it's the wrong pocket. So yes, and yes, and thank you for raising both of those issues.
Yeah, we're getting to 1 minute.
1 minute, last question, right?
Rachel Stein with Public Counsel. Is there a particular definition of the term unhoused that you would propose that advocates or educators use that would be helpful and inclusive?
Yeah, I think the housing urban development definition is the one that I think is most comprehensive in terms of it doesn't look at young people who are only in shelters, on the streets, or in cars, but also looks at multiple family arrangements as well, because that seems to be the big definition. The whole idea, if you look at the work of Earl Edwards, he talks about doubling up being the biggest component of young people who are unhoused, yet those young folks don't get counted in the McKinney-Vento Act. So I would say take a look at the HUD definition, and then we need to push to make sure that we have a consistent definition, because at this point we're woefully undercounting, and that's part of the problem.
But to even do a footnote, HUD's comprehensive, McKinney-Vento is brick and mortar overnight housing, right? I think there are many organizations that have proposed revised definitions which are worthy to look at, and even HUD and McKinney-Vento have some major holes in how they're conceptualizing it. So I'd say we need kind of a 2.0 or 3.0, you could say, of both of those, working in tandem. But if that's a takeaway from this, please, let's do it.
I know you said only one more question.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you, you touched on teacher training and the impact of race, ethnicity, culture, and class, which is never talked about, on kids. What can we do? Do you have any specific solutions or specific ideas for improving our teacher education systems so that our teachers are prepared?
Yeah, how much time we have for that one, Dr. Sanders, right? That's a great question. As someone who's involved in teacher education, there's so many things that we don't focus on, and I think child welfare needs to be a big part of that. Child development needs to be a big part of that, and sort of the larger historical, economic, and social political factors that shape young people's abilities to learn. I think, and if I can just say this, we spend too much time having pre-service teachers in university classrooms learning theory, and not enough time out in schools and communities and talking to people in real time. Okay? I think that's where the real learning needs to take place, in communities and in schools with families, not learning the stages of Piaget's operational development, the things of that. And remember, I took you back there, right? So I think we have to radically redefine it. But the challenge is, who does the teacher training in the first place? Oftentimes, the people who do the teacher training have very little knowledge about what's currently happening in school context. So therefore, we have the misinformed informing the misinformed. Yeah, I said that. I can't believe I said that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I know we're between lunch and the next part of the program.
Yep.
But
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thank you very much.